This is Streets and People, conversations about people and projects shaping how we move. Find us at getaroundcaboolture.au. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I am here in the studio with Will Symons. I know Will because it was actually James Lang who came on the show, and we were talking, well, we know what has to happen, so why isn't it happening? James mentioned that you had done your master's thesis at university a couple of years ago. So I think we've been trying to get this happening for about 9 months. And by the time it goes live, it'll be next year. It's a slow process, like everything in transport land. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture. And Will, whereabouts are you calling from?
Hello, Wendy. I'm coming in from Wurundjeri land, people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, known as Melbourne as well.
What made you interested in doing a thesis on that topic? Why does it matter to you now? Or maybe it doesn't because you've now got a job working with James Lang, lucky you, and maybe you've decided actually it's not relevant.
First of all, I think it is still quite relevant, and it's really helped me with my work as a transport planner, getting an understanding of the context that I'm working within. What brought me to this topic was throughout my studies, my Master of Urban Planning, I ended up often focusing on transport within the projects that we would do, in particular having an interest in active transport, so people walking and riding bikes. And to me, there's a clear trend that a lot of governments, whether they be local, state or federal, say all the right things. They have great policies, great strategic plans. There seems to be this gap between theory and practice. We have the ideas, but we haven't got them in the ground yet. And there's a lack of cycling infrastructure across the board in the Australian context. That was something I wanted to investigate further and see if I could contribute something to the field of study and to give people involved in the process an opportunity to voice their perspective of what potentially is going wrong and what barriers that we're facing the pathway towards a more sustainable transport system.
Just to give a heads up, so a master's thesis, you do your undergrad degree. Did you do honours?
No, I didn't do honours. So this was my first major piece of research.
And so a master's thesis, just in case, because not everybody knows the academic terms, it's a 2-year project, and you do research and you do a practical and you write a long argument, which is called a thesis. It's a research report. And it's grueling and grinding and you go mad. Not quite as mad as when you do a doctorate, a PhD, but nearly.
It's also fun. But yeah, so in my program, it was a 10,000 word minor thesis that was completed by the end of the master's program.
Tell me about what was useful from the thesis and why is it still relevant? What have you brought from your master's thesis into your current work now?
The main thing that it's given me in this line of work that I am now as a consultant is a greater understanding of the environment that local government workers are in. And the majority of our work is with local councils throughout Victoria and sometimes the rest of Australia. And quite often the transport planners in these sort of organisations are low in number. They often have lofty goals that they want to achieve within their local area, but they might be facing countless barriers. And having done this research, I feel that it gives me a leg up in understanding where councils are coming from and a way to work through the project or the problem that they're facing. For instance, in the Victorian context, there's quite a big power imbalance between local government and state government, particularly with the approval process for anything that needs to be done on the roads that a council has in its area. So for instance, the state government must approve any change to a local street if it is around what's called a major traffic item. This is often like traffic lights, roundabouts, that sort of thing, anything that affects the broader road network. And I think that is such a big barrier that councils face. And I think working through that, knowing that is the lens that we need to adjust to and make sure that it's approvable by the state government, that's something that is really important when working with local government and trying to help them get active transport infrastructure in the ground.
It's the same here in Queensland, that If it's near a bus stop, a state road, which would be basically it's got 2 lanes on both sides or 3 lanes on both sides, that's a really big marker that you're on a state road. What are the ways that a person can navigate the infrastructure change so that it doesn't have to go through state, or it can more deftly navigate the state process?
One way that councils can approach it to reduce the exposure to like state approval, for example, is to try find areas that are suitable for cycling or extra walking infrastructure that might avoid those major roads. For instance, there might be some disused lands that goes through a local residential neighborhood, and it might be a great candidate for a new shared user path that people can walk, wheel and cycle along. It might just have minor road crossings of local government roads and not be near any traffic lights. And then there you go, you've got a project much less prone to the state approval process. It's looking at projects and aligning with state policy. In Victoria, we have the Principal Bicycle Network, which is a big map of principal bike routes and strategic cycling corridors throughout the entire state. So one way that projects could get a bit of a leg up in this process is to be aligned with those corridors, that network, and then say to the state government, this is on your policy as well, and it's something that we want too, and therefore we're hoping to get this approved, and there's this backing it up. And I think that that can position these projects in a stronger way and to help both governments achieve their sets of goals.
We do have the same here in Queensland. We have the PnP, the Principal Cycling Network. It's not a particularly helpful map, I would say, because they've had this stuff in place for decades, but there's nothing built on it because it's not very well designed and it's not community friendly. One of the things I've been doing is walking around my local neighbourhood, and I've noticed there's a lot of cul-de-sacs, and they often have a pathway between one cul-de-sac and another street. It strikes me that maybe one of the ways is actually improve those little laneways between houses rather than trying to go on the road so much. Is that the sort of thing you're suggesting?
Absolutely. I've been lucky enough to work on a couple of projects that have a really similar objective as what you just mentioned, and it's about creating what's often called a local bicycle network, which affirms it's on the local roads and they're in council's control. Councils are starting to recognise that you can make relatively small investments and have really big returns in terms of how user-friendly these areas can be with small interventions like modal filters, for example, something that restricts the movement of motor vehicles but enables people walking and riding to pass through an intersection. These things can have a massive impact on how a neighborhood feels and how friendly that is to people who aren't in a car. This is actually the real low-hanging fruit for councils, is to say, okay, state roads might be very difficult to change. It's out of our control. It has broader network implications. But we can look after our own backyard and say these local roads are where we want our active transport networks to go on. And what we're going to do is find ways that we can make it more accommodating for people walking and cycling. And it's a massive opportunity. And I hope that these projects that we've done come into fruition in some point soon, and like they're more in the feasibility type stage. But I think that there's massive scope for growth in that area.
And when you were doing your thesis, or since now where you're working, what has the community reception been like about new bike lanes, or the way they've been designed, the way they've been implemented? How much community engagement have you been a part of, and did that make any difference?
I've had a bit of exposure to the community engagement process projects we've worked on. Sometimes it's more just the council who does it and our role is not involved in that, but there's been a couple where we've helped provide guidance for engagement. And I think that lessons that we've learned throughout it is that it's really important to communicate early and to find out what issues they have with the road network around their place of residence. And starting at that stage, it makes the conversation more open and it gives them a chance to voice their concerns first. And the design is then a response to what they've relayed rather than you coming in a technocratic way and saying, this is what will be the best option for you. We know best. And I think that the projects where we've brought people in to voice their opinion have had a higher likelihood of being accepted, really. For instance, a local council in kind of a residential area, we actually did a process where we asked people to ride a series of local bicycle networks that we just mentioned earlier, these residential roads, and we'd mapped out a series of routes. And then we asked these people to provide their take on it and how they felt while they were riding in it, what they would change, what areas they felt safe in, where they felt unsafe, and then we use that to inform the next stage of the project. And I think those approaches to engagement are more fruitful in general than the classic, here's a design, what do you think?
As it was explained, so the question that is open is, do you want the driveway moved 10 metres to the left or the right? That's not community engagement, because it's not engaging the community. It's a feedback process, not an engagement process, I guess is the way to put that.
Yeah, and it can be quite tokenistic, which I think can create a real hesitation or resistance to even being involved in the process at all from the community.
So in your thesis, what were the themes that came out by people working in council? So you worked with people in inner Melbourne, middle suburban Melbourne and outer suburb Melbourne, is that right? So of course here we are in the outskirts of Brisbane, and I'm just wondering, perhaps if you wouldn't mind starting with the outskirts suburbs. It's just the toughest one because it's so high car dependent. Perhaps you can describe the sort of things that the council officers were having to deal with.
The study design for my thesis involved an area of Melbourne extending from the centre out to the western fringes. And I think one local government area that's really quite similar to where you are in the city of Moreton Bay is the city of Melton on the fringes of Melbourne in the west. It's a rapidly growing population, but it's extremely car dependent. It's quite a challenge for council to attempt to overcome. There's a lack of state provided infrastructure like railway and bus services. It results in a lot of cases of forced car ownership and that car dependent nature of development. And also Wyndham was the other outer region. These areas, in comparison to the inner areas, the council workers there reported the really strong car culture, and that car dependency stems from a reality that these people living in these spaces have really not had another option. If they've been raised there, been brought up there, have been there for a decade, the only thing they know is to rely on the car for transport. And it's such a challenge to overcome this social norm, this expectation of how transport occurs. And the general perception from these council workers was that there's an obsession by people living in these areas to attempt to solve traffic congestion. However, the way that they expect it to be solved is to provide more space for cars. It's not to go to other modes of transport, such as riding bikes. So for them, when they're attempting to bring active transport infrastructure into the picture in these contexts, they met the barriers of a huge expectation from both the residents themselves and the traders in these areas, where there's this expectation, almost a perceived human right, to free parking in convenient areas. And I think that is so prevalent in these fringe areas of Australian cities. And that perhaps, as a combination of many factors, is the biggest barrier to overcome, this societal expectation of increased car infrastructure.
I know exactly what you're saying there. And in fact, the state government is putting in a couple of big roads. And there's a lot of resentment about why are they putting in the bike lanes as part of the principal cycling network, because that takes up space, and that's the reason why all these houses are being demolished. It's because of the bike lanes. I mean, the logic behind there is quite narrow, because of course if it wasn't for the cars pushing out the bike lane to be wider, you wouldn't need to destroy all those houses. Were there any suggestions? Were there any ideas? What emerged from that?
One example that comes to mind when you just mentioned that process of designing and pushing out to the edges is a quote from one of the interviewees was, engineers have the mindset of working from the middle of the road reserve and outwards. And in the middle of the road reserve, we have as much space as we want for cars. And then you push everything out to the edges and it becomes, what can we get rid of to work within this road reserve? And often it's that bike lane that gets pushed away, or it becomes narrowed to a point where it's not really that functional anymore. Trying to shift that mindset of what's a non-negotiable in design is a really important aspect of these areas. And it's something that is going to take time. It's something that needs to have a concerted effort against. It's about updating those guidelines, updating the processes and the expectations from these projects. Without that, we will continue to have these massive 3, 4, 5 lane roads in these growth areas because that is the current status quo.
And there just isn't the land space. So you can either have housing and accommodation or you can have cars, but you can't have both. So as a community, we sort of need to be reckoned with that reality. Everybody wants their car because it's super convenient and people have had that their whole lives. So say we've got a mum with a couple of small kids. And she goes, well, how do I even begin to say I want a bike lane? Because actually the mum, who is my friend, she lives on a section of the Bruce Highway, just off it. And they're about to do a massive road widening project. The school where her little boy goes is on the Bruce Highway, and the side street just next to the school is massively busy. Lots of prangs. It's a prang point left, right and centre. I've seen the data on that. And how can she then say, well, how do we get more bike lanes? How do we get more kids riding to school, or even her friends and their kids riding to school in those conditions?
I suppose the relatively obvious answer would be to try unite with other people at the school and see what they feel about it and whether they would want to try unite in a coordinated effort to voice their concerns. And I think that it's a classic move, but it does have impact done in the right way. But something that's potentially a bit different and something that I have thought about as a way for people to get involved, which isn't too time consuming, is to use this tool that I was recently introduced to. Lucy Saunders from Healthy Streets came out to Australia recently and gave an industry seminar, and she introduced us to these Healthy Streets design check tools. And there's a couple of them that are really simple, but I think have a huge potential to be effective in communicating perspectives of people to decision makers. And there's one that's about measuring the feelings of a street. I think that's the sort of thing where you can, in a somewhat formal way, voice your concern and provide whoever the decision maker is with a detailed and documented reason for why you feel this way about a street. And it might lead to a conversation within that government body to then say, hey, how can we respond to this person? This is how they're feeling. They've gone to the effort of making measurements of this street, and this could be something that we need to respond to. And I think if a few more people started doing this sort of stuff and created this atmosphere of a constant flow of information to decision makers, then it has potential to really change how design is done. There's some new ways that we can go about it rather than your classic email to government.
I have used that app because I went to an event with Lucy Saunders and the Healthy Streets app, and it is a very easy app to use, definitely. And I would encourage people to give it a go. I'll put that in the show notes. Since recording this interview with Will, I've asked Lucy to come onto the show, so that will be the one that goes to air after this one. If somebody has a disability, chronic pain, limited energy, limited funds, other than Healthy Streets, what do you suggest?
I'll do my best to answer it without being able to fully understand the perspective of your listener. One thing that could be a reasonable way to try to create a bit more impact is to frame the communication with decision makers, council officers in a way that really articulates it with safety language, and to identify the reasons why a certain piece of infrastructure or a road design is really incompatible for them, and to use language such as near miss to emphasize that there is a really significant problem with a piece of infrastructure that is there. And I think that, at least from my personal experience, I've had more success when I frame things in that language. And I think that in general, our local governments are more responsive to that type of communication. So potentially that's something that they can undertake going forward. But yeah, whatever you can do, hopefully get some outcomes that are better.
That's a good lesson for me because I write lots of letters, but It's very hard when it comes to framing it with a safety lens. I forget. So that's a good reminder. So thank you very much. And I always think the terminology near miss is very strange. And then I realized it's a military term. And it comes from when people in war used to try and get the battleship and then they didn't hit the battleship. And I'm going, why are we using this in driving? Are we intending to kill pedestrians? So I think maybe we need to start looking and saying it's a near collision or a near incident. They missed me, but only by a fraction.
And thanks for the update on the language. That is a very important part of the equation, and I think I'll stop using near miss now.
So if somebody's at the bottom of the food chain at council, people have this idea that government is over there and it's really far and it's really inaccessible and it's opaque. And let me tell you, as somebody who is a chronic letter writer and always connecting with council, it can feel like that because you get these smarmy letters back that don't say anything. It's very dispiriting because it says, we're great and we're doing everything amazingly, so why are you bothering us? Because we're not going to do anything because we haven't got any money and we're great. So that's the basic letter framework. So I want to really encourage our listener to remember that these are just people who are just trying to do the right thing in the job with the limitations they have. Now, you, in your thesis, had heard from a range of different people at council, from inner city to middle to outer. So give me some of the barriers.
The burden of proof on cycling infrastructure relative to car-based infrastructure, and this was something that came up throughout a few of the interviews and was quite a common theme. And it was this idea that there is quite a gap between the perceived impact of cycling infrastructure and the actual impact of it once it goes in. And this idea that people are resistant to change and might be scared of having their parking taken away and an expectation that it will always be there. But there is an opportunity within the way we communicate these cycling related projects that we can make it clearer to people involved that it actually can bring positive impacts, and those negative impacts you're fearful of, we can talk through them and we can explain to you why they might be not as significant as you think. It relates a little bit to this concept, the hill of hysteria, which is something that's quite common in anything changing to the built environment that people are used to. There's this idea that the world is going to crash and burn if we put in a protected bike lane and take some car parks away. Once it actually goes in, there's a slow reduction in this hysteria and people realize, oh, this is actually working. And I think that trying to equip people involved in the process with some more tools for allaying concerns or promoting the benefits will help to reduce the extent of this hill of hysteria and also enable people to see another reason behind these projects. It's obviously complex and difficult, but I think local councils can adjust the way that they do their engagement and have much better outcomes.
So one of our local councillors is very keen to have more bike infrastructure. How might a councillor and, say, the transport team collaborate more effectively to get these across the line? So what is the councillor's role in getting it across the line?
From my research with council officers and the barriers that they face, obviously they related to things from councillors as well because they work with them on a daily basis. I think that with local government being the most accessible level of government in the Australian system, councillors feel quite, vulnerable to backlash and community perceptions. And I think that it's quite important when trying to bring change to a neighbourhood's appearance, to its built environment, to try get in front of that backlash a bit. And instead of saying, we want to change this because we think it's good, it's again coming back to the idea of consulting earlier and bringing them in and seeing what they would want from transport, if they could come up with ideas what they want from a transport future and trying to respond to that. There's amazing stats on the latent demand for cycling, like people who want to ride bikes but feel they can't because of the current environment. There's concepts like pluralistic ignorance, sounds quite wordy, but it's basically the idea that many people in society share these similar ideas of change but are unwilling to voice them. And I think that a councillor could have great impact if they were a bit more creative in the way they engage and get out in front early and try to find out more about the people the change would be affecting closely, and then work with the council officers to respond to that collection of information, rather than being like, we want more cycling infrastructure, this is where we think it should go. I think that way of decision making and governance is unlikely to be successful in the Australian context at the moment with transport.
And is there anything else about your thesis that you think would be useful to share?
In a more positive thought, I identified the institutional barriers to implementation of cycling infrastructure in Melbourne. And I was rereading my thesis to prepare for this, and I looked at the recommendations section, and in the 2 years since I've published it, there's actually been a couple of changes that, in theory, if my research was accurate, should help to address these problems. One of the big issues in Victoria that was identified through this work was that 30 kilometres per hour is not recognised as a speed limit by the state government, and it could only be implemented on a trial basis. There was a couple of councils that have done that, but many have not been able to get that through. I think it was only a couple of months ago now, the state government has come out with a policy that recognises the benefits of 30 kilometres per hour, it advocates it in certain contexts, and it provides the people I interviewed with a tool where they can say, yeah, this is what the policy says, this is what we want, and this is the outcome that we should get. And I think that is of a massive institutional barrier that's been brought down, particularly for those local bike networks that we talked about earlier, those local streets. All of a sudden you can have a network of 30 kilometre hour streets that have got well-designed traffic calming to reduce speeds and volumes of vehicles. And all of a sudden you have these neighbourhoods that are fantastic for people to walk and ride through. Another one that came up really frequently in the interviews was the outdated guidelines for cycling infrastructure in particular. And that has recently been published by Austroads with a new update to cycling and micromobility guidance. And that outlines exactly how we should go about designing for cycling and all those different micromobility devices that are popping up willy-nilly. There's also like travel to school guidance, which has the intention of providing practitioners with guidance to develop networks around schools that are more beneficial for people riding and walking to school, to try get kids to be more active. And I think that there are steps being taken to address these barriers. It will be step by step, but I think that we actually are moving in the right direction, which is fantastic.
Full disclosure, both Will and James Lang from Stantec worked on that Austroads guidance. Is there anything else you would like to share? Any final thoughts? Anything you think I should have asked and I forgot?
I'd like to share, and I think it relates to the conversation we've had today about how can council workers do things differently to achieve these transport outcomes that most people in this industry want to achieve. I was lucky enough to go to Amsterdam this year and do a short program there. One of the case studies that they taught us about from the Netherlands context was this small municipality called Renkum, and they have a new mobility policy. And I think that it's really world leading and has huge impact to be a precedent for other councils to copy. There's 3 key tenets that it seeks to achieve, and it's every child from the age of 8 has the right to travel independently to school, sports, shopping locations and cultural destinations. The elderly and people with disabilities have the right to grow old with dignity and freedom, and the street should serve as a shared public space. This approach reorients the problem that we're trying to solve as transport professionals and means that we can bring decisions back and hold decision makers accountable to this policy that is far more inclusive, far more people-centric, and should achieve outcomes I think a lot of people want to see. There's opportunity for Australian local governments to do similar approaches and to challenge the norm, and we might see the follow change as well. Something I learned from being over there is that they haven't got it all figured out either. There's always things that can be improved within mobility, and there's always people that are overlooked, and there's always people we can respond to better with the way we design the built environment. It's great to learn from different places and then see how you can apply it to wherever you're based.
What you're suggesting from Rankin sounds really useful. All right, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been great, and it's been good to have a bit of an idea about the structural barriers which are real, but also that structural barriers change, and you've already highlighted some in the recommendations. And there are these great stuff happening all over the world that is inspiring and great to see. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Wendy. It's been really great to speak with you.
That's Streets and People. Thanks for listening. You can find more at getaroundcaboolture.au.